All right, look at this. We're back to doing more long-form interviews. Isn't that nice?
Okay, kick your feet up, get some popcorn. It's going to be an entertaining one.
Right? You got a lot of time. Hang out. In fact, this is about, we actually interview the author of an incredible book, which, Christian, you love this book.
That's right. So Clint Smith the third, the homies with Aaron West. Okay, so
right.
the family is just coming together. The family is growing. But Clint Smith, a New York Times bestselling author, wrote an incredible book called "How the Word Is Passed," and it is incredibly powerful, to say the least.
It is a #1 New York Times bestseller. That's incredible. And to give him the whole title of the book, it is How the Word Is Passed, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America. And I know what you're thinking. Yep, that's exactly what we're about to talk about. Because there's so many parallels between not just Clint, obviously friends with Aaron, how they met, the world of soccer, but this just goes to show just how enriched the world of soccer is, and how, while it's a small world, it is filled with people that come from so many other parallels that you didn't even realize were involved. And obviously, unfortunately, this topic has reared its ugly head yet again within the world of soccer, especially with the World Cup. And that is a subject that we touch upon with Clint Smith. And I can't wait for you guys to hear this interview.
Take a look. All right. I am excited for today's show.
This is an honor.
This is an absolute honor because we are joined by a New York Times best-selling author, which
It's crazy.
It's pretty crazy. We usually
on our show. A poet is about to be on our show.
There are people that are tuning in right now, and they're honestly going to be like, yo, why is he talking to these dudes?
Yeah. Yo, he needs to fire his publicist.
But not only do we have a best-selling author and poet, I think he's also most well-known for being Aaron West's friend. So this is pretty cool.
Top of the resume, for sure.
Yeah, first line. But we are joined and honored to have Clint Smith. Thank you for joining us, man.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Aaron probably didn't tell you the story about how, it's wild because, yesterday I watched him on Paramount Plus, and he was like a commentator, a pundit on an Arsenal game. And we, when I met Aaron, I was 17. He was, I guess, 19. I was being recruited by Davidson College.
Which is where he went. That's right.
Which is where he went.
Yeah.
Steph Curry is our claim to fame, for those who confuse us otherwise with Dickinson or Denison or any of those other D liberal arts schools. But he brought me. He was the person I stayed with on my recruiting visit.
Oh, wow.
And so it's like, it's just wild to see the way that he is. We used to sit in the locker room because that's the only place back in 2005, 2006 that would get Fox Sports or Fox Soccer, the Fox Soccer channel,
Fox Soccer Plus,
where you could watch the English Premier League games, and so we could all go to the locker room and like watch Arsenal, and now this man is on TV getting paid to talk about Arsenal. It's unreal.
Isn't it crazy? Wearing a turtleneck, a sweater, and chains on the outside.
Gold chains.
Turtleneck and chain, bro.
Man. He looks like he's about to introduce the newest bootleg iPhone.
He's ready. He's ready.
Yeah, absolutely incredible.
The glow up is real for both of you, because I was looking up, on Twitter, I searched Clint Smith and Aaron West to see what the communication is like publicly. And there's when you tweeted about being #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, he tweeted, I don't even have a roast. I'm just happy for you. I'm like, wow.
That must impossible.
That must mean that the roast must be so severe that he has to highlight that he's not roasting you.
There's one day of the year that I don't get roasted in the group chat, and that was when I was #1 New York Times bestseller. But the next day, they went right back to it.
They're right back to it.
The next day, they were like, "This is a holiday. This is a reprieve for you." And then afterwards, you gotta have the homies who keep you humble. So.
Yes,
very much so. So
they will remind you wore that shirt that one time forever.
Don't look. I thought you were gonna say you were looking up pictures of us from when we were college kids, which you shouldn't do that. It was a mess.
Yeah, I've already seen a couple, and I'll probably add them in post. But I'll look because I've seen a couple of them posted. But yeah, you guys had a look, an image of the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, it was the time of like triple XL tall tees. And,
I was about to say, were y'all counting stacks in your white tees?
Man,
Damn, in my white tees.
Yeah, clearly we went hard at Davidson College. It was a wild.
Sponsored by
time.
Galaxy Tees. Let's go. If you want them good quality, you got to get Galaxy, bro.
Right.
So I want to get started by we have to talk about your book. It is incredible. I did read the book, and I mean, like a lot of people have said this, but I was absolutely floored. I mean, there is,
for those of you who don't know what book we're talking about, is How the Word is Passed.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very powerful book. #1 bestseller.
Right.
Huge.
So I want to make sure. So I just want to give my impression of it, because there was a little bit of, I think so. I'm Dominican. Alexis is Cuban, and so we're both born here, but our connection to Black history or African American history might be a little bit different, coming from a Caribbean sort of perspective. So when I read books like this, I tend to learn a lot because I was not informed of a lot of this information. But I think the first impression was your chapter. It's one of the early chapters about Thomas Jefferson, right? And the how slavery was viewed at the time, and how people kind of operated under like, yeah, it's bad, but that's how things kind of are. You know what I mean? So I want to talk about when you were doing your research for the book and kind of hearing about all these specifics and these perspectives. What was your take on what people thought of slavery at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it might be helpful to give a sort of a little bit of background about the book. So as you said, the book is called How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. And it started in 2017 when I was watching several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And I was watching these statues come down, and I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people? Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which isn't to say that, you just take down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee and you suddenly get rid of the racial wealth gap. But it does help us recognize the sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help us understand what's happened throughout American history and help us understand the ways that certain communities and certain groups of people have been disproportionately and intentionally harmed throughout American history. And so I was thinking about my city. I was thinking about New Orleans. I was thinking about how New Orleans was at one point the largest and busiest slave market in the country. And I had no idea about that growing up, right? And that I went past these statues of these men who literally fought a war predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, maintaining and expanding, bondage over my ancestors, and had no conception of like who they were. And so I started to ask a lot of questions like, well, how is the history of slavery being told and taught, not only in schools, but also through our public landscape, right? Through our monuments, through the memorials, through the museums, through the plaques and all of these things that shape the sort of landscape of again, iconography that we see. And I started in New Orleans and then kind of went across the country, visiting plantations, prisons, cemeteries, memorials, monuments, and try to get a real sense of like, what are the places that are telling the story honestly? What are the places that are running from their responsibility to tell this story? And what are the places that are kind of doing something in between? And talking about, Monticello was one of the first places I went. Yeah. And I wanted to go there because, Jefferson is kind of like this microcosm. He's like this personification of the larger story of America, which is to say that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here or one over there. It's that you have to hold both of those realities alongside one another. And Jefferson is someone who sort of embodies that cognitive dissonance or those conflicts of interest, which is to say he is a person who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children that he had by an enslaved woman on his plantation, Sally Hemings. He's someone who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and then wrote in his book Notes on the State of Virginia that black people are likely inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind, right? And so part of what I wanted to do when I went to these places was to get a sense of like, well, how does a place like Monticello, which is responsible for communicating and conveying the legacy of Jefferson and the legacy of this land, are they telling a sort of two-dimensional story of Jefferson, the way that I was taught about Jefferson growing up as being this president, this intellectual hero, this great man, or are they telling a more complicated and more honest story about who Jefferson was that takes seriously the fact that he was in many ways the intellectual founding father of this country, but also the fact that he was an enslaver, right, and separated families and had people beaten, and had a relationship when he was in his 40s with a teenage enslaved woman that bore several children, right, in ways that we can't understand as in any way other than being coerced, given that it's an enslaver and his enslaved property. So yeah, it's kind of like me trying to go to all these places and get a sense of how these places tell the story of the history that happened on that land, and how do we understand, to your point, what happened then as compared to how we tell the story about what happened then now.
I mean, these conversations have been going at least way more in the mainstream, alongside where sort of you kind of got the inspiration for this book, right around that era where these statues are coming down and whatnot. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. There's no connection with me with seeing sort of the ruins, if you will, or the markings of slavery outside of hearing about it in school. Christian and I in 2018 did an 8-city tour, part of which was in Virginia. We're driving from Richmond to Virginia Beach, and part of that was to drive through Charlottesville. And I was like, oh my God, those are the statues that are on the news. And then as we're driving, and I brought it up, and I think it surprised some of the people in the car with us that are from that area that I was so drawn aback by it. And then we drove through an area where there was no buildings, and I was like, yo, why aren't there buildings over there? Like, I'm just being like a dude from the East Coast. I'm like, yo, you should develop this area. It's like on the water. And then someone goes, well, you can't. That was the slave market. You're not allowed to build there. And I was just like, I mean, in my brain, the car crashed. That's how I was like, a what? Like, I've just never experienced it. And I think it made people uncomfortable because they're like, well, we're not like that. I'm like, I'm not saying you're like that. I'm just shocked that that's there. Yeah. You having grown up in the South, I don't know if this has become more apparent to you in your life or whatnot, but there is a strong, it feels like this fairly horrific but important part of our culture hasn't really been taught to the majority of Americans. In the same way, when I talk to someone from South Africa, they're like, oh no, we did a lot of soul searching and coming to terms with what we've done after the fall of apartheid. It feels like we never did that. Has that become more apparent to you in your life? Do you think this book might help sort of bridge some of those gaps?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One, it's really fascinating to hear you talk about that, in part because Virginia is absolutely, it was the center of the Confederacy, right? And it was a place that was central to America in so many ways blossomed out of colonial Virginia, right? It kind of expanded from there. That was in so many ways, with Jamestown and everything. It was kind of the centerpiece of the American project, especially in its earliest days. And so it makes sense, given its history, that there's so many places. I mean, there's no place in Virginia that doesn't have a relationship to slavery, right? Like that, it is scarred into the landscape of that state on every single street, in every part of its soil, in every tree, everywhere. What's interesting, though, is that there's a history of slavery in New Jersey. There's a history of slavery in New York, right? Like New York City was at one point the second largest slave market in the country after Charleston. And so it's interesting to think about the ways that history is talked about and memorialized. And I don't know the extent to which, when you were growing up, that was a part of the discourse, right? Because I think for me growing up in the South, it was like slavery was this thing that happened in the South and didn't happen in the North, and sort of the sort of moral the thing that undergirded that that was kind of implicit within it was like, oh, the North was the good guys and the South were the bad guys, and it's like that doesn't fully account for the sort of complex way that slavery existed in different iterations all across America, right? Like New York is not a place that that didn't have its own relationship to slavery. Even people were enslaved in New York, and even when people were no longer enslaved in New York after gradual emancipation, people in New York were the ones it was the banks in New York who financed slavery. It was the insurance companies in New York who provided the collateral. It was the political infrastructure of New York. In 1861, the mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, proposed to the rest of the government. He said that we should secede from the Union alongside with South Carolina, Alabama, Virginia, all these states of the Confederacy, because their social and political interests were so deeply entwined and ingrained in the slaveocracy of the South. So it's fascinating because I think so many people who grow up in that region don't even have a sense of their own state's connection to this history in like a really profound way.
Yeah,
we really don't. All we were taught is if a slave made it past the border of the North, they were good.
Yeah,
like that's literally all we were taught.
It was super chill when they got up here. You know?
Yeah. We're like, come
everything
on,
was all
dude.
good. Yeah. Come play some PlayStation. Like, it's
that was one of
Have you tried Latin food? Like we're just waiting for them.
That was one of my favorite, or at least like very interesting parts about the book, about just the foundation of the American economy was really, really so tied to slavery, and that part is really what is definitely not really taught. But when you were giving the specifics about insurance companies and banks that are very much still around today, that built their wealth on slavery and still have records of slaves being transferred to other people or other banks, and you realize, like, we think of these giant corporations and especially insurance companies. You just think like, oh, they've always existed in our lives and they've always been big. And then when I'm reading your book, I'm like, man, that's how they got so influential and powerful, just on human capital.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think to your point about the economy, I mean, it's hard to overstate the extent to which the bodies and the work of enslaved people made the United States a global economic superpower. In 1860, the 4 million enslaved black people in this country were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined, right? Like worth more than all the manufacturing in this country combined were the bodies of enslaved people the year before the Civil War began. So this was not like a sort of peripheral part of the American economy. This is like what made the American economy go. And it's what in many ways contributed to the global economy, right? Because America is this becoming the central trading hub for the rest of the world. And so many of the things that are being traded, even if they are not directly produced by enslaved people, they are part of this sort of domestic ecosystem of trade that is impossible to have without the work of enslaved folks.
Look, I'm glad that I think these conversations are starting to be had, and it is all falls into like people talking about critical race theory and trying to be more transparent and honest, especially about the shame that this country holds, because I think it's an opportunity to move forward in a very positive way. I do want to connect this to soccer in one way. In obviously the World Cup is coming up. It is in Qatar, and
nothing's gone wrong with this. There's been
completely innocuous, benign.
I can't figure out how you're going to connect this to slavery, actually, Christian.
But I want to just get maybe your perception of what all the stories you're hearing about. People are calling it modern day slavery of what happens, in Qatar, and how these stadiums get built, and there's a lot of people doing the work to kind of have those conversations. Grant Wall it already started a piece where he was interviewing workers at the hotels that work at the World Cup, that are housing people for the World Cup, and some of them are like, they say this is, that they have a terrible experience. They don't enjoy coming to work. And then some say like, hey, it sucks, but this is what I have to do. I have to give my passport to my employer, or, it's difficult to move from job to job, but, I have to take care of my country, back in Thailand or back in India and stuff like that. So what are your thoughts when you think about such obviously a global sporting event being connected to things like this?
Yeah, it's I'm so glad that Grant wrote that piece, and Grant's such a the soccer world is lucky to have a journalist like Grant who I think really digs into the complexities of something like that and doesn't allow it to be. It's not, in his piece it's clearly, as you point to, like, it's not a black and white kind of thing, right? Like, there's a lot of texture and nuance that has to be teased out. I think what can be true, and this speaks to the workers in Qatar, but also workers generally around the world, is that, like, it can be true that one really needs a job in order to get money to send back to their families. And it can be true that someone is grateful to have a job that gives them money for themselves and for their families. That in and of itself does not mean that you have not also been exploited, right? Like, that in and of itself does not also mean that you have not been taken advantage of. That in and of itself does not also mean that you are working in an environment that represents, like, a potentially fatal threat to you and your life. And so I think we talked about with Jefferson, like, holding multiple truths. I think with, workers in Qatar, like, that's also a thing that we have to hold, that some of them may both be grateful for the job, and also that doesn't mean that the things that are exploitative and violent and dangerous about it aren't still there. I mean, we see this throughout so many countries across the world. We see that in America is not immune to that by any means. There's definitely jobs where that in which that's the case, here as well. So, it does become a sort of, like, morally tricky enterprise to try to, like, all right, how do I ethically navigate, like, how to think about and talk about the World Cup? And I don't mean this as a, like, well, fuck it, like, whatever, but I don't know what it means to watch any FIFA sponsored event and not feel like some sort of, like, oh man, like, it's such a corrupt organization. There's bribes everywhere. There's, like, people taking money out of this pot and putting it in that pot, or putting it in their pockets. Or, we just had the 2018 World Cup in Russia. Right. And people are like, I had no idea that Vladimir Putin was this kind of person. Like, Vladimir Putin's been the same person for the last however many, so like, it's not as if this is the first time that FIFA has, like, placed spectators in a position where we're, like, watching something that we also feel kind of icky about, but, like, and you try to say, like, I have these values, but at the same time, I really want to watch the World Cup, or I really want to travel here, but this place has laws in place that are, like, run counter to any notion of justice that I believe in, right? And I think there are a lot of places like that, and I think the most important thing to do is to be is just to name it, right? And so and just to say, like, this is for people to name, in the same way that people we're talking about, what it meant, like, to be an LGBTQ person in Russia wasn't better in 2018 than it is now. But there were people who were like, this is, but at once enjoying the World Cup and also saying, like, this isn't right. And I think it's got to be the same thing with Qatar. But the whole thing is just strange, man. It's in the winter, and then You saw, I'm sure y'all saw that sign of like all the things that weren't allowed.
Right. It's just
It's
It's
bizarre.
ridiculous.
everything that's fun and you can enjoy about life was on that sign.
Right.
Yeah.
Truly. I mean, it was like you turned it around. I was like, no hot pockets, or I'm like, no pancakes, no joy.
Really?
Yeah.
You gonna take Pop-Tarts from me? It's the only
Truly.
joy I have.
Truly, you can only have the plain
you are-
Pop Tarts.
But you are allowed vuvuzelas, which is like, why are we keeping the bad things?
That's the one thing
Getting rid
that
of
we
all the
should
fun
have banned.
things. Yes.
Okay, a couple quick
But
things.
you are also a soccer fan. You're also a big Arsenal fan.
Yeah, that's
How
what
do
I
you
was
feel
gonna
so far
get
about
to.
the season?
Gooner.
Mikel Arteta, the
another
greatest
Gooner.
manager of all time.
I
Are we-
believe. I believe in the trust the process, baby.
Have you been Arteta in this whole time?
I've not been explicitly Arteta out.
Okay, all right.
You're not
I've
true.
been-
We'll get proof of this
You're
from
not
the
on
group chat.
Arsenal fan TV screaming. All right.
I'm not on Arsenal fan TV.
No.
No, I mean it's
honestly, Clint Smith on Arsenal fan TV would blow everybody's mind, bro. They would be like,
Man.
yo,
It would be pretty wild.
There'll be a
trying to
calming.
get
What
out
you'd be
there.
saying would be more well thought out than anything else. I've been on Arsenal fan TV.
calming
and I
presence.
was just riffing, you know.
Oh man. I mean, this season's been unbelievable. I'm tired. Like Aaron will tell you that like every year, with the exception of last year where we lost our first 3 games and didn't score a goal. But every other year, they give you the thing. You know, Arsenal fans know they give you that little bit of hope. You're like, this is gonna be the year. This is gonna be the season. I feel it. This is gonna be. And then I say it in the group chat, and Aaron is like, shut up, stop jinxing it, don't say anything. I'm tired of you. As if I am to blame for the downfall of us, having been a mid.
Can I tell you something? I'm not in the
mid-table
group chat, but now I'm going to blame you for when our season falls apart, bro.
club. Truly, I'm
This
trying
damn
to
Clint
keep
Smith.
it. So I haven't said it. I just do eye emojis after we win. That's all. That's what I just send some eye
Yeah,
emojis.
okay.
I'm like, okay, you know, let's see. It's I became an Arsenal fan. Actually, writing a piece about this now for the Atlantic. I watched the 1998 World Cup when I was 10 years old, and like many black kids playing soccer in the 90s in the United States, I was the only black kid on my soccer team, and I was watching France play. And they had this guy, this 20-year-old, Thierry Henry. And I was watching them play, and he scored this beautiful goal in like the 90th minute against South Africa, I think in their first game. And I hadn't watched a lot of soccer up to that point. I just remember I like had a grilled cheese sandwich and was like sitting in front of the TV and, was caught the end of the game. And it was such a beautiful goal. And also I was like, oh, he looks like me. And I was so like, I didn't have the language, I don't think, to sort of like tease that out when I was 10, but I was so drawn to him as a player, and so drawn to the fact that like we shared a complexion in a sport in which so few people shared my complexion. And I was watching France versus South Africa, which is like black people all over the place, right?
Yeah.
It was like, it was like just Emmanuel Petit, who was the only white person on the field, basically.
Yeah.
And so then I followed Henri's career, and then he ended up at Arsenal. And my mom went to a conference for work in London, I think that next year. And she was in a cab, and she was like, oh, my kid loves soccer. I'm trying to bring him back a soccer jersey because apparently they like soccer in England or whatever. And she asked the cabbie, and she was like, hey, like, I'm trying to get my son a soccer jersey. And I think he was like upset that she said soccer, but she was like, I'm trying to get him a jersey. What's the soccer team in London? And she, she's saying this because she's used to American sports where it's like each city has a team, right?
Right.
And so she doesn't know that London has 223 teams in it.
Yeah.
And so, but the cabbie was clearly an
You're
Arsenal
in one
fan.
right now in this cab. This is Cab FC.
I'm the manager.
Yeah,
Right.
we're in the
Basically.
17th division.
Truly. We play Wrexham next week.
Yeah. Hurry up, get your boots on.
And he was like, ma'am, there's only one football team in London, and that's Arsenal. And so she was like, great, now I'm going to get an Arsenal jersey, the team in London. And she brought back a jersey, and then it just kind of, Henri and the Arsenal jersey, I think it just solidified it. And I just have been a Arsenal fan throughout. Those early days were amazing. I mean, I was a fan, and then like 2 years later, we were invincible and we were undefeated.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, every season's gonna be like this.
I
It
made
was
the
amazing.
right decision.
Yo, this is great. I was like
I'm
picking.
glad I picked the one team in London.
Right. I'm glad I picked the one team in London. It's like picking. It's like not knowing anything about football and being like, I like the color of the Patriots uniforms.
Right,
Those seem nice.
Yeah.
You know, in
And
the
then
Tom
going on a
Brady
run.
era. Yeah. And so, yeah. I mean, I just love that team. I love the history of that club. I love what Arsene Wenger did. I love, you know, I think a few weeks ago they celebrated that moment where they had Arsenal was the first team to have 9 black players start a match at the same time, which was more than had ever existed in the Premier League. And that team, you know, so I think that was also a huge part of it. And then over the last few years, you know, I mean, the last several years have been rough. And it's interesting because I remember Wenger left how long ago? 4 years now?
2016, 17,
Yeah.
17, something like that.
Man, I remember being like, I'm so tired of third place finishes. Like, we should be competing for the title. I'm so sick of these
So
second and
annoyed
third
that
place
fourth
finishes.
place was a trophy. Now I'm like,
Yo.
I need a fourth place trophy right
Bro,
now.
I'm
dude.
an Everton fan,
crazy.
so third place would be. I mean, I want a parade for third place.
Truly. Oh man, it's wild. You know, they tell you never appreciate what you have until it's gone. But this might, you know, this is the year. I'm wary. It's still early. We're like 10 games in, but they look good, man. They look
They do.
real
Yeah,
good.
they very much do. Yeah, look,
It's exciting
I
times.
I remember reading. I read Arsene Wenger's book, and he has a very, you know, because what's the joke, Alexis? Like Arsene Wenger.
Oh, Wenger, they say Wenger's a genius, but he's the only one who knew you were allowed to sign black players.
Right.
That's one of my favorite things to say.
But when you hear him talk about it in the book, it's like it's just like common sense. He's like, the common sense was that he wasn't racist. He was just like, yeah, these guys are good. I'm gonna try to pick up some of these players. So he had the foresight.
Yeah,
to
bring in players that are good. You know,
What a concept.
Right.
Yeah.
But so absolutely fascinating, man. Clint, we have to get you back on, man, because there's too much that we didn't talk about, and you're welcome back anytime, man. But this is
when you write that book about Arsenal, you definitely
we
want to
go.
have you back on.
There we
Come
go.
on.
you need any quotes from us, we got you.
Yeah, I'll write the forward in crayon. Let's go.
So funny.
Clint Smith, is there anything specific you want to let people know about? You know, obviously they can find the book everywhere, but is there anything you got that you're looking forward to? You want to let people know about? Feel free, the floor is yours.
The Atlantic, where I'm a writer, is doing a World Cup newsletter. So we'll have a World Cup newsletter coming out, I think every day during the World Cup. So keep a lookout for that. For me, I got a new book coming out in March of next year. It's a collection of poetry. So I write prose, I write poetry. And it's about like fatherhood. I got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old who we didn't have time to talk about this, but I brought them to the Arsenal game in Baltimore a couple months ago during the summer.
We were there.
Oh,
And,
we were
like,
there.
Were you there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
snap! But like man, it's wild because my kids, like, we have, you know, the Premier League is on all the time in the background on the weekends, and I think my kids, before this, they would be like, I'm so tired of soccer being on TV all the time. Put on Daniel Tiger, put on Bluey. Like, what are we doing?
Gracie's Corner, you know?
Gracie's
Yeah.
Corner, you know,
I'm trying to jam right
Alma's
now,
way. And then I took them to the game in August, and like, it completely transformed their relationship to both soccer and Arsenal. Like, my son is 5 years old, and he left that day. He was like, this was the best day ever. Right. And it's just, I mean, I think because it became so much more real to them. They were like, oh, this isn't just a thing that's on the screen. Like, there are real people who are like, and like, you know, he saw Bukayo Saka score in front of him. Right. And so now it's like not just the person on dad's jersey. It's like, oh, this is a real person. And he had his hot dog and she had her chicken nuggets and they were screaming and dancing. And it reminded me of like when my dad used to take me to New Orleans Saints games when I was a kid. And it's like, I loved the Saints so much when I was a kid, and you know, now that I'm an adult, I'm like, how much of it was the Saints, and how much of it was like, this was this time I spent with my dad. And
Right,
you know, it ends up being fused together, right? And that your love for the sport is also tied to the community that you're a part of as you like engage with it. But it's been wild because now my son just like runs around screaming like Gabrielle Martinelli. You know, on week he's like Martinelli, and and so it's been cool. And like they both have their little Arsenal jerseys. My wife now like is much more. She watched the All or Nothing the documentary, and I think she mostly watches because she thinks Mikel Arteta is like the handsomest man on earth. And I was like, you know, that is the one person I'll accept you thinking he's more handsome than me. It's fine. But
I thought
but
I had
now,
a good hairline until he got on TV.
man,
Like,
and the permanent 5 o'clock shadow just looking like he's a handsome man. I can't deny it. But now it's cool because like post documentary, post Arsenal game, like I feel like my family's on board in a way they weren't before. So shout out to preseason U.S. games, man.
No,
really
dude,
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, we gotta.
Dude, your son's gonna be 7 years old on Arsenal fan TV, being like,
right.
He's like, why is my son yelling Obama blood clot young? I'm like, what? Where'd he get this from?
Oh man.
he ain't even on the team no more, man. That's great.
Clint, this has been so cool, and maybe for the next book, if you want to come back on the show, you're more than welcome. This has been super cool. Absolutely honored to have you on the show. Everybody, make sure you follow Clint on social media. I know you're big on Twitter. Clint Smith.
At Clint Smith the third.
The third. So go for it,
Go.
Clint. Seriously, absolutely honored. Great meeting you, and thank you so much for doing this.
Appreciate y'all. This was a lot of fun.